the autumn of 1888. London's East End was already a hellscape of poverty, disease, and desperation. But then something far more sinister began stalking the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. They called him Jack the Ripper, but what history books don't tell you is that his crimes weren't just about murder. They were about something far more disturbing, the twisted intersection of sexual violence, Victorian repression, and a society that had created the perfect hunting ground for a predator. What if I told you that Jack the Ripper's true horror wasn't just in what he did to his victims, but in how Victorian society's sexual dysfunction created him? What if the very moral code that claimed to protect women actually delivered them straight into his hands? Tonight, we're diving into the darkest chapter of Victorian crime, not just the murders everyone knows about, but the sexual psychology, the societal failures, and the horrifying details that investigators tried to hide from the public. This isn't just the story of a killer, it's the story of how an entire civilization's sexual shame created a monster. Let's start with what really happened to those women, because the sanitized versions you've heard barely scratch the surface of the horror. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly weren't random victims. They were all prostitutes working in the most desperate area of London, but here's what makes this truly disturbing: the Ripper didn't just kill them, he performed ritualistic sexual mutilation that revealed an intimate knowledge of female anatomy and a pathological obsession with reproductive organs. The police reports, kept secret for decades, revealed details that would shock even modern forensic investigators. Annie Chapman's murder scene was so grotesque that police surgeon Dr. George Bagster Phillips refused to describe the full extent of the mutilations in open court. What he whispered to officials was that the killer had removed specific organs with surgical precision, and arranged them in a deliberate, almost ceremonial manner around the body. But here's where it gets truly chilling: the Ripper's signature wasn't just violence, it was sexual humiliation. Mary Jane Kelly's murder scene in Miller's Court was described by investigators as the most horrific crime scene they'd ever encountered. The killer had spent hours with her body, turning her small room into what one detective called a chamber of horrors that defied human comprehension. The pattern was clear: this wasn't a killer driven by rage or opportunity. This was someone acting out deeply twisted sexual fantasies on the most vulnerable women in London. But here's the truly disturbing question: how did Victorian society create the conditions that allowed Jack the Ripper to thrive? The answer lies in the sexual dysfunction that plagued Victorian Britain. While the upper classes preached moral purity, they had created a system that treated women's sexuality as either property to be owned or disease to be contained. Middle-class Victorian men were taught that sexual desire was shameful, that good women didn't enjoy intimacy, and that physical needs should be satisfied with fallen women who didn't matter. This created what psychologists now recognize as a perfect storm for sexual violence. Men were conditioned to view women in two categories: pure angels who were untouchable, or dirty prostitutes who deserved whatever happened to them. The Ripper targeted the second group because Victorian society had already dehumanized them. Even more disturbing was the medical establishment's role in normalizing violence against women's bodies. Victorian doctors routinely performed brutal procedures on women's reproductive organs to treat everything from hysteria to nymphomania. The line between medical treatment and sexual assault was often non-existent. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, a prominent Victorian physician, performed thousands of clitoridectomies on women without their consent, claiming it would cure their moral insanity. This medical violence against women's bodies normalized the very type of anatomical mutilation that became the Ripper's signature. The killer wasn't operating outside Victorian society, he was taking its misogynistic medical practices to their logical extreme. What's perhaps most horrifying about the Jack the Ripper case isn't what the killer did, it's how the authorities responded to protect Victorian sensibilities rather than catch the murderer. Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren made the shocking decision to wash away a crucial piece of evidence: graffiti found near Catherine Eddowes' body that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Warren claimed he was preventing anti-Semitic riots, but documents released decades later revealed the real reason: the message contained sexually explicit language that officials deemed too obscene for the public to see. Even more disturbing was how police handled witness testimony from other prostitutes who had encountered the Ripper. Rather than protecting these women or treating them as credible witnesses, authorities often arrested them for solicitation or subjected them to humiliating medical examinations. The women who could have provided crucial information about the killer were silenced by the very system that should have been protecting them. The most shocking cover-up involved the royal family itself. When rumors began circulating that Prince Albert Victor might be involved, the palace didn't just deny the claims, they systematically destroyed evidence. Documents from the royal archives show that several witnesses who claimed to have information about royal connections to the murders mysteriously disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The Ripper investigation revealed that Victorian authorities cared more about protecting the reputation of male privilege than catching a killer who was butchering women in the streets. But to truly understand Jack the Ripper, we need to examine the twisted sexual psychology that Victorian society had created in its most disturbed members. Modern psychological profiles suggest the Ripper wasn't just a random psychopath, he was likely someone who had been deeply damaged by Victorian sexual repression. The ritualistic nature of his mutilations, the focus on reproductive organs, and the escalating violence all point to someone acting out sexual fantasies rooted in Victorian medical and moral obsessions. Consider this chilling detail: the Ripper's surgical knowledge wasn't just random, it specifically focused on female reproductive anatomy in ways that mirrored Victorian medical textbooks. This suggests the killer may have had medical training or access to anatomical knowledge that was typically used to control and pathologize women's sexuality. Even more disturbing was the killer's ability to blend into Victorian society. The Ripper wasn't a wild-eyed monster, he was likely a respectable gentleman who appeared normal to his neighbors and colleagues. This fits perfectly with Victorian social dynamics, where men were taught to compartmentalize their sexual desires and maintain a facade of respectability while engaging in behaviors they considered shameful. The most terrifying aspect of the Ripper case is that it wasn't an aberration, it was Victorian sexual dysfunction taken to its extreme. The same society that produced the killer also produced thousands of men who bought sex from desperate women, who supported brutal medical procedures on female bodies, and who believed that certain women deserved whatever violence befell them. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a monster, he was the inevitable product of a society that had turned sexual shame into a weapon against the most vulnerable women. So here's the truth that Victorian society desperately tried to hide: Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer who happened to target prostitutes. He was the logical endpoint of a culture that had systematically dehumanized women, medicalized violence against female bodies, and created a class of disposable women who could be brutalized without consequences. The real horror of the Ripper case isn't just what happened in those dark Whitechapel alleys, it's how an entire civilization looked the other way because the victims were women that society had already decided didn't matter. The killer understood this perfectly, which is why he could operate with such confidence and brutality. What makes this even more chilling is how the same attitudes that created Jack the Ripper continued long after his reign of terror ended. The sexual violence, the medical abuse, the systematic devaluation of certain women's lives, these weren't anomalies that disappeared with the Victorian era. They were patterns that would continue to shape how societies treat sexual violence for generations to come. The next time someone romanticizes Victorian morality or talks about the good old days of traditional values, remember Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Remember that their killer wasn't fighting Victorian morality, he was its most faithful disciple. If this deep dive into the darkest corners of Victorian crime left you questioning everything you thought you knew about history, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We're just scratching the surface of the twisted psychology behind history's most infamous crimes. Drop a comment below: what other Victorian-era cases do you think hide even darker secrets? And share this with anyone brave enough to handle the real story behind the headlines. Trust me, the rabbit hole of historical horror goes much, much deeper.